Now we're going to start looking at how situational factors approach people's behavior. And we're going to start off with Kurt Lewin's foundational work. Now, up to this point in the course, and we're going to continue to do this, we've been trying to understand why people act unethically when they don't want to, why we personally act unethically when we don't want to. And what we've been doing is we've been covering different approaches and different theories that enable us to see why things can go wrong even when we don't want to do something wrong. So some of the approaches that we've covered so far are the God's character approach. That was the distinctively Christian approach where we looked at God's character, his holiness, his justice, and his love to see how things that didn't conform to his character can be considered unethical. And when we don't conform to God's character in our behavior, we tend to act unethical. We looked at the codification approach, this idea of writing down a list of rules that people need to follow and the limitations and strengths of that. We looked at the rational approach. That was Kohlberg's theory of moral development, where we consider that different people take into consideration different factors when they decide if they're going to make some type of decision, whether something is ethical or not. We looked at moral hypocrisy theory, which describes how people want to appear to be ethical more than they actually want to be ethical because that's costly. We also looked at the cultural approach or the generational approach, how looking at how changes in different generations result in different cultural elements like different levels of individualism, and how that approaches how that influences what people think is ethical. We looked at equity theory and organizational justice. And in this justice approach, we saw that when people don't think things are just, they tend to respond in ways that may be unethical. We looked at the virtues approach that describes how the more virtues, the more character strengths, the more upright a person is, the more likely the person is likely to be ethical. And closely related to that, we have the spirit-led approach, which is another distinctively Christian approach, with the idea that God gives Christians his Holy Spirit to convict and to lead us to act ethically. And then we looked at moral foundations theory, which emphasized the role that emotions play in the decisions that we make and as to whether something is ethical or not ethical. So now we're going to transition and start looking at situational factors, factors outside of the individual that will influence how our behavior. We're going to start off with Kurt Lewin, and he's kind of like the founding father of organizational psychology and social psychology and applied research and action research and group dynamics. He was a super foundational person who is at the origin of a lot of different fields, all closely related to organizational psychology, and all of which are very relevant to ethics in organizations. We're going to start off by looking at what's known as Lewin's equation. And what Lewin's equation is, it says that behavior, that's what B is here, is a function of, that's what that equal and F means. Behavior is a function of both the person, P, and the environment, E. So in using Lewin's equation, if we want to predict what someone's behavior is going to be, if we want to understand what's going to influence somebody's behavior, we have to look at the person, and then we have to look at the person's environment around them. So the person is anything that's unique to the person. Personality traits, values, learned responses, how the person was raised, their education, their attitudes, their needs, their goals, and their personal choices, what they personally choose to do. Those are all the person. And so in some of these approaches that we've looked at, that's all we're considering is a person. Um, oh, it's my emotions, it's my rational thoughts, it's all that which influences my behavior. But Lewin added to the idea that it's not just the person, it's the environment, everything exterior to the individual. Our environment influences us immensely. An obvious example is whether someone steals office supplies. If there is a camera recording everything that happens with those office supplies, theft will be much lower than if there is not a camera on the office's supplies, because people think, oh, I don't want to get caught, and they're recording it. So that camera in the environment will affect people's behavior. But the environment's a lot more than a camera. It's all the people, all kinds of forces going on exterior to us. Now, this is interesting from a historical perspective. So Lewin came up with this in the 30s and the 40s, and this is very different than the first few generations of psychology, especially Freud, because Freud's understanding of people's behavior related primarily to the person's past, especially his or her childhood. And so Lewin's equation got us away from this weird Freudian thing that we're trying to have get over our Oedipus complex or something like that. And it just says, okay, well, let's look at who you are as a person, and let's look at what's happening in your environment and see how those influence your behavior. So this is Lewin's equation, and it's super useful because it gives us a place to start when we want to analyze someone's behavior. We say, okay, we want to understand somebody's behavior. Well, the two places to start are with the person, what's unique about the person, their traits, values, learned responses, and so on. But not just look at the person, but look at the environment, everything that's happening around the individual. And using these two pieces of information, we can get a better idea of why someone would behave in a certain way. So this is Lewin's equation. Behavior is a function of the person and the environment. Now, the other idea from Lewin that I want to introduce is called force field analysis. That sounds like something from a sci-fi movie, but what it basically does is says that there's forces that act on an individual to either maintain the status quo or to move him or her in a specific direction. And this is true for an organization as well. We can use this force field analysis on an organization. And so here we've got a little entity there. It looks kind of like a bean, and there's different forces acting on it. And those forces will either move it one direction or another direction, or maybe another direction, or maybe it'll just keep it in the status quo, keep it from moving at all. And so it can move it in a desired goal, it can move it in a non-desired goal, it can move it in an ethical direction, it can move it in a non-ethical direction. And so there's a bunch of forces, and we don't know how many forces, but there are many, many different forces acting, having to do both with the person and the environment, working on any individual or any organization. And now this is important because it contrasts to what's known as the fallacy of the single cause, or the fallacy of single causation. A lot of times we'll say, oh, that person did that because they just want to be mean, or somebody did something just because. And no, that's not how humans work. There's always these multiple forces working on people due to their values, their personality, past choices, what they've learned, people in their environment, expectations that people have on them, the resources that they have available to them, the options that they can foresee. There's all these forces coming in a lot of different directions, and the strongest forces are going to win out and push the person in that direction, which is in contrast to this idea that there's only one, there's a single cause for some effect. That doesn't happen in humans. There's always multiple causes. And in statistics, we'll see that, yeah, there's a lot of things that are related, but there's nothing that describes, that completely describes why somebody does something, because there's always other forces involved. So here we've got a couple ideas from Lewin that will help us understand this situational approach to ethics. One is that behavior is influenced both by the person themselves and by their environment, and there are different forces acting on a person from both the person and the environment that push them towards certain behaviors.